My name is Homa Durrani, and I am an art psychotherapist. Um, I've been working with children with differences, with developmental and emotional behavioral issues for more than 15 years. First, in the capacity of an educational therapist, where I taught literacy to children with dyslexia. And then as an art therapist for more than 11 to 12 years now. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is a topic that is very close to my heart for a number of reasons. I think the primary reason being that my son, who's autistic and is 26 years old, had severe sensory processing issues. And that is actually what inspired me to research SID, or sensory integration dysfunction. And that's what led to the development of a framework that I have developed to do art therapy with autistic children. Of course, this is the GLOW Conference 2023, which is powered by Actionable Innovations Global. The topic of today's discussion is using art materials to address sensory behaviors in the classroom. My email is on this slide. If anyone has any questions after the discussion, those of you who are watching the recording, please feel free to email me. And you can refer to my website, coloredcanvas.net, for more information about me and the course that I run, which is also, about this topic. So let me begin with 4-year-old Alex, who has trouble sitting during circle time in school and tends to hit other children or teachers almost every day. He runs around the classroom, bumping into people, knocking things down. Alex does not calm down even when his teachers try to engage him with activities he usually enjoys, like puzzles. His teachers think he is acting out because his mother is expecting another child. Now, I'm sure most of you educators have come across children who are like Alex or indulge in behaviors that are similar to Alex, and you may have wondered, what is at the root of these behaviors. A lot of educators may not be familiar with sensory integration dysfunction, or which is also called sensory processing disorder, and how the symptoms look very similar, or the behaviors that arise out of that dysfunction look very similar to a child who is acting out or might appear to be oppositional. And that is why it is very important to understand what exactly is sensory integration dysfunction. Because the prevalence in any classroom is at least 5% to 20%, and 20% is actually conservative. So 20% of children in your classrooms could have or will have some degree of sensory issues. Hence the importance of understanding and being able to recognize sensory dysfunction. And secondly, the second important reason why it is important to understand SID is because it's very difficult to distinguish between sensory and emotionally driven behaviors. And if you cannot distinguish between them, you're probably going to manage them in a similar fashion. So, but the thing is that if you don't address sensory behaviors appropriately, there is a good chance that the child who is experiencing a sensory meltdown or a breakdown and is not being attended to appropriately will become even more anxious and begin to feel unsafe in the classroom. So moving on, let's see what actually is sensory integration dysfunction or sensory processing. I will use these terms interchangeably because they are one and the same thing. So, and what is the relationship between sensory organs and the sensory domains? So our sensory organs are what basically you can see on the outside of the body: our eyes, our skin, which is one of the largest sensory organs, the nose, the ears, the tongue, which we use for tasting things. These are our sensory organs, which essentially receive information or input from the environment. And this information is then processed in the brain in our sensory domains. So, in a sense, the sensory organs are like almost like the receivers or receptacles. And then the information goes to the brain and it registers in the auditory domain, will register what you hear, what the ear hears. In the visual domain, process things that the eye can see. In the tactile domain, it will be where the textures or touch or even pressure is processed. Then we have the olfactory, which has to do with smell, the gustatory, which has to do with oral taste and textures, the vestibular, which is to do with balance and movement. And then there are two other which you may not be as familiar with. One is proprioception. Now, the sense of proprioception is a very, very important sense. I mean, not to take away from any of the other senses. So proprioception is actually that sense of body position in space. So for instance, like I'm sitting on a chair right now, but I know that I am seated. I have the sense that I'm seated. I am not floating somewhere in the air. So I know where for instance, my nose is, or my ears are located, or these are my limbs or my hands or whatever. So that is the sense of proprioception. And then we have the sense or the domain of interoception, which is basically awareness of internal body functions, meaning body temperature, our heart rate, things like cramps in the stomach, feeling of hunger, palpitations, anything that has to do with the internal body function. So the ability to recognize, to be aware of the internal functions of the body, of how is the body responding to maybe things that are happening outside in the environment. So when there is a consistent pattern of disruption in the way the brain processes information from all or some of the senses of smell, taste, vision, hearing, vestibular, proprioception, it is termed sensory integration dysfunction. So from the point where the sensory organs take in the information to the point where it ends up in the sensory domains, something happens along the neural pathways where that information, either it gets garbled or it takes a convoluted route. And by the time that it's processed in the sensory domains, it is either anxiety provoking, it's very unpleasant, or sometimes even painful. So let's look at this hypothetical child who has sensory issues. And remember, sensory issues do not happen to one sense only. It's like a sensory continuum. So for instance, one child may have multiple domains that are affected. So let's take a look at this child, for instance. So he's over responsive, meaning that this child is oversensitive to certain, in this case, certain smells. So, smells that will not maybe bother the neurotypical person, it might actually cause a meltdown in this child because they're actually extremely repulsive to this child, or they just trigger maybe a panic attack in this child. So he's oversensitive to this. Now, of course, this over responsivity can happen along all the domains, but I'm just citing in this child's case, it seems that he's over responsive to this one particular sense of smell. On the other hand, the child may be under responsive at the same time, but to a different sense. So in this child's case, for instance, let's call him Alex again. He is unable to register certain sensations, meaning that either he requires outside help, someone's assistance to feel pressure, or even feel touch, for instance. And because he's unable to feel it, he might seek it himself, which means he might bump into objects, or hide under pillows, or fall onto cushions, and so on and so forth. All right, so then we go to sensory motor disorder. Now, in this, with Alex, the case here is that he can be clumsy and he can fall over things sometimes. Now, when a child has sensory motor disorder, then they may be affected across multiple domains. So the balance may be affected, the sense of touch, also the sense of proprioception, with the result that this child may again be very clumsy, may have issues with fine motor and gross motor skills. Then sensory discrimination is another type of sensory issue, where the child is unable to discriminate from where a particular sensation is coming from. So where is a particular smell coming from? Maybe even discriminating between temperatures. Is something too hot or too cold? Or even, with textures or sounds. So they're not able to identify the source, and this can lead to fear and to anxiety. Sensory seeking is something almost somewhat similar to under responsive, because when a child is under responsive to something, they will crave input. So let's assume that Alex is under responsive to movement. He cannot feel movement, so he will spin to seek that movement. And this may remind you of certain children who run around the classroom and are not able to sit for long periods of time. It's possible that they are under responsive, and therefore they are sensory seeking. And sensory avoidant it sort of corresponds with the over responsive child, who, because they are so oversensitive to input from the environment, they are going to avoid things. So maybe avoid walking on grass or on sand, for instance, and might walk on tiptoes, may not want to touch certain textures, and even their clothes, or let's say the tags in their clothes might irritate them. Whereas, the neurotypical person may not have any idea why this child is having a meltdown, but it could be something, really as small as the kind of fabric that the child is wearing. So as I said, SID is a continuum. Children can have deficits over multiple domains. They can be hypo and hypersensitive across their senses. The sensitivities can vary through the day. So sensory integration disorder is comorbid or can occur with a range of other issues. So as you see, it can be with ADD, with gifted children with depression, with auditory processing issues, autistic children, of course, a large percentage of them, in fact, most of them have issues with sensory integration, anxiety, Tourette's, OCD, and other developmental issues. So it's not really surprising that in a classroom, you will have a high percentage of children with some kind of sensory issue. So is the behavior sensory, or is it an emotional reaction or a behavioral reaction? So how to tell? Now, this is how you may be able to gauge within the classroom. If you're observant, sensory behavior is not instigated by a demand, and the child is not concerned by your reaction, whereas an emotional reaction, wrong spelling of emotional, anyway, is usually instigated by a demand or to seek attention. The child, if the child is having a sensory meltdown, they are not in control, and they may seem to be unaware of their environment. If it's an emotional reaction, the child is aware of their surroundings and reactions of others. So they're watching, they're looking at a reaction. And thirdly, the behavior in the case of the sensory behavior will not vanish instantly, and the child may need longer to recover. Whereas the meltdown, the emotional meltdown, can end abruptly when the need is met. So the child who's having like a sensory issue is not going to stop if you give them a consequence, or they're not actually demanding anything. They're just maybe something out of the blue, they'll have a meltdown, something has triggered them, and they seem to be totally out of control and sort of in their own uh, sort of shell, if you like to call it that. So now we come to the interesting part. So what role can art materials play? So art materials are multisensory, and therefore they can engage all the spectrum, the spectrum of the senses. They come in different chemical compositions, textures, smells, temperatures, shapes, forms, malleability, and they can tap into emotions and evoke a variety of sensory reactions. Now, the reason why I think that the role of art materials within a classroom is so important is because you just need the very basic art materials to be able to address, um, SID uh, to a certain extent. Now, the teacher, the class teacher, the educator is not an occupational therapist, and their role is not to treat SID because they can't. But what they can do is that they can manage it to a certain extent within the classroom. And of course, if let's say a particular child has very serious sensory issues, then of course you refer them out to the occupational therapist, and then they are the specialists. But within the classroom, because the child is spending such a long period of time, a long part of their day in the classroom, I think all teachers and educators need to be aware, first of all, of the causes of behavior. And if they're sensory, then at least be able to do something within the classroom to keep the child, to sort of lessen the anxiety in the child and keep the classroom safe for them. Okay, so how is it? What is the role that art materials can play and why? So, well, let's look at paint first. Paint is a fluid, highly emotive, highly arousing material. It can be used on a variety of small and large surfaces, of course, using hands, brushes, palettes, knives, rollers. But what is important to note here is its fluidity and the fact that it is highly arousing. Pencils and markers, rigid and controlled, can be used for repetitive mark making, doodling, sketching, and coloring. Now, whereas paint is highly arousing, pencil is doing exactly the opposite. It's rigid and it's controlled, which means that it's more grounding. It's not going to, the person who's using pencil is not going to go out of control. Okay, clay and Play-Doh. Earthy, rounding, regressive, provides containment. It can be sculpted, coiled, molded, pinched, rolled. So clay is a fantastic medium to use, especially where proprioceptive input is required, or where the heavy tactile work needs to be done. Pastels, again, emotive, earthy, highly proprioceptive. And just to remind you, proprioception is that sense of body. So imagine using something that makes you feel your hands. You can rub the pastels and smudge them with your fingers on paper, kind of sort of break them between your fingertips, and similar to crayons, which are again proprioceptive, rigid, can be used for repetitive mark making, doodling, sketching, coloring. And then there are the non-traditional art materials like slime, goo, gack, shaving foam. Not sure if you would like to have these within the classrooms, but they do have a role to play. So of course there's lots of other art materials, but these are the basic materials that I think any classroom can be easily equipped with. So how would you put this into action? So I've created 3 scenarios just to give you an idea. Of course, nothing is set in stone, and there's going to be trial and error. But I think the most important first step is to have the awareness, and the next step is, of course, then to try and figure out what works best for which child. So going back to Alex from the beginning, so Alex has trouble sitting down during circle time, tends to hit other children, runs around, bumps into people, knocks things down, cannot calm down, etc., etc. So let's assess what is going on with Alex. Is it sensory or emotional? So Alex's behavior is not instigated by a demand. He seems to be unaware of his environment. He takes long to calm down, so possible indicators that there is a sensory issue happening here. He has trouble sitting down. He is hyper-responsive, meaning that he's bumping into things and running around, and he's seeking, sensory seeking, because he is knocking things down and he's bumping into people. So he's obviously looking for some kind of some kind of an input, some kind of tactile, maybe pressure or touch, etc. So the intervention in this case would be using Play-Doh, clay, therapy to pound, mold, knead, pull, or pinch. Of course, you can get innovative. These are just a few ideas that I'm just putting across to you. But you can play around with this stuff. So large crayons to scribble on a big sheet of paper. Why? Because this will satisfy his sense of movement that he's looking for, the sensory seeking bit. The fact that he's running around the classroom, he may be seeking movement. So if he has a large sheet of paper on which to use huge crayons, and he can employ his entire body to get that sense. Then kinetic sand with molds, figurines, or objects that can be hidden under, dug out, or even painting with different textures. Again, the textures, he can, if possible, use his hands and feel the different textures for the input that he is looking for. Scenario number 2 is a 5-year-old Jessie cries, screams, runs covering her ears in the music room or sports hall where the noise is amplified. She does the same in the classroom when her classmates are noisy. So what is it, sensory or is it emotional? Now that's the first thing. Now, most of the time, if it's emotional, let's say, if as a teacher, I guess you're aware of whether a child is, if he's being bullied in the classroom, is having some social skills issues, or if something else is going on in the home, yes, possibly it could be emotional. But let's say if we rule that out, then why, there's a big possibility that if none of the other things are happening, that, something sensory is happening, especially because Jessie's covering her ears in the music room and within the noisy classroom. So the thing to look out for is that, does Jessie seem to be aware of her environment? Or let's say when she has her ears covered, she's, maybe her eyes are shut and she's just in her own sort of world. Does she calm down when she's given a consequence? Or does she really take long to calm down? So highly likely that Jessie is probably hypersensitive to sound. Of course, the first thing one would think of is noise cancelling, noise filtering earphones or earbuds. And then maybe Play-Doh again, something to hold, to mold, to knead, to pull, or to pinch, which can be given to Jessie, while she is in her music room, to hold in her hand, which something that she can just knead or pull at. Again, pencils or crayons for scribbling. Maybe just a piece of paper or some kind of a drawing pad where Jessie is able to scribble while she's sitting in the classroom and she has this on the desk next to her. And ripping paper and pasting again is a calming down activity. Okay, scenario 3. Mike is a 4th grader. He's not able to sit at his table to finish work, constantly finding excuses to visit the toilet, not able to focus in class, but at home he is reported to be able to complete his work. His teachers are convinced he is being difficult and that someone is helping him with his work at home. Now, is it sensory? Is it emotional? Sometimes it can be confusing. Could Mike be sensory seeking or hypersensitive because he's unable to sit at the table? Or is there something else in the environment that's bothering him? Something else could be happening at home because, the nervous tummy needing to go to the toilet. So you might end up being a little confused with certain children when you're not able to, let's say, eliminate one possibility or the other. In this case, too, art materials can actually play a very important role because at the end of the day, they have the ability to inhibit and evoke certain emotions and reactions. Now, this is, of course, not, I don't have enough time to go into that because my focus in this presentation is on sensory integration dysfunction. But with a child where you are not too sure whether it's sensory or not, the art materials that, might help could be clay, crayons, cutting, pasting, pencils, and all, because they're more grounding, they're more rigid, or they're more sort of calming. And so a bit of trial and error. So some activities that again can be done at the table: pinching, pressing, rolling, molding, doodling, coloring, stamping, peeling, crushing, tearing paper, sticking, squeezing stress balls. I often make these, balloons that are filled with Play-Doh, and kids like to draw sort of faces on them and just give them in their hands and have them squeeze the stress balls. So, how to establish a sense of safety? Some tips here. Pay attention to your body position, which should be at or below the child's level when you're engaging with the child. So, let's say that the child is having a meltdown and you realize that it's because of some kind of a sensory issue. You don't want to approach them, sort of in a dominating kind of way. So, you should be at or below their level because the child is already very anxious. And you use a calm, audible voice and very composed gestures, and allow for breaks and pauses, when you're working with them. I published this one book on the approach that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. It's called Sensory Based Relational Art Therapy Approach. This is basically supporting, it's kind of it explains, goes deep into the use of art materials for supporting emotional needs in children with autism, but it is not just restricted to children with autism. It's an approach that can be applied to basically children with sensory issues as well as with self-regulation issues. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, art materials have the inherent capacity to regulate the system or to regulate affect. Also, I have this 2 to 3 hour short course that I offer, which again is very similar to the topic under discussion today, in which there are some quizzes and hands-on activities and exercises that if someone is interested in, they can take the course. It's just a 2 to 3 hour long course. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.